All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar featuring guest presenter John Laffey. Please note that all attendees are going to remain muted throughout the duration of today's webinar. If you have any questions for the presenter or for PJR, we encourage you to use the designated question tab within the GoToWebinar control panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Parker, and thank you all for joining us today. We're going to be talking about some common errors and pitfalls I've seen as a lead auditor for 27001 and some strategies to discuss, or I'm sorry, some strategies to avoid those. With me is Dejan Kosutic, and I know I said that last name wrong, and I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself and give you some background on what he does.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So yeah, my name is Dejan Kosutic. I'm the CEO at Advisera, and I started with 27001 almost 20 years ago, and now it's I'm mostly now on the consulting side, or let's say on the publishing side related to 27001, yeah, I mean, Advisera, my company, we already worked with thousands of companies related to 27001. So I would say we have a pretty good overview of what works and what doesn't work with 27001.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And as far as my background, I became a lead auditor for 27001 back in 2015. So I have been conducting audits for almost 10 years now. Yeah, it's been a trip, but hopefully with my perspective on the audit side and Dejan's perspective on the consulting side, we'll be able to give you guys some good tips and strategies to hopefully avoid these pitfalls. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start talking about some of the most common issues that I see when conducting these audits. And the first place I wanted to focus on was the risk assessment process. I think this is especially important because it's kind of the cornerstone of the whole management system. You know, it's going to directly affect the company's ability to be able to treat their information security risks. So one of the first things that I see fairly frequently is that you have to define an acceptable level of risk. Sometimes I think companies just didn't realize this, and other times I think folks are hesitant to want to put kind of that firm, acceptable level of risk. But I think what's important is putting that line in the sand, and if you are still concerned about the risk levels that are showing up, you can certainly change the way you evaluate risk, but it's definitely important to have that acceptable level of risk defined so that you can clearly demonstrate to everyone who's interested, hey, these are the things that need to get fixed. You know, it can help you prioritize things. These are our biggest risks, etc. So yeah, key component there. Another issue I see around the risk assessment process is risk assessments don't get conducted at planned intervals, or more frequently when changes are made. So companies typically, when they're first certified, they do a great job with their risk assessment. They go through, they look at all their assets, their people, their information, you know, very thorough risk assessments done. And then sometimes it kind of gets set aside and put on a shelf, so to speak, and we come back for the next year's surveillance or the surveillance after that, and it still looks the exact same as when we first looked at it 2 years ago. You know, and another thing I see is obviously business has changed. Companies might migrate to a different platform. They might start using a new cloud service provider. Maybe they move physical offices. All of those types of things should definitely have a risk assessment performed to make sure that there isn't any new or changing risks that are being introduced to the company due to the changes being made. Next up, the standard calls out specifically that risk owners must be identified for each risk. This is another one, for whatever reason, I do see this missed a lot. We'll see a nice risk assessment with risks identified and evaluated, analyzed, but there's no risk owner. In terms of who the risk owner should be, typically it should be the person who's most responsible for the asset or system that the risk is tied to. You'd ideally want it to be someone who has the authority to treat the risk, and someone who's knowledgeable to understand the risk and subsequently come up with a good treatment plan. And then the last issue I see around the risk assessment process is risk not being prioritized for treatment. Again, the standard does call this out as a requirement. So once you've gone through your risk assessment, you have your different factors that you look at in order to determine the level of risk. You want to make sure you're taking that last step and saying, okay, these risks are the ones that we need to get addressed first. Because they can have the biggest potential impact, the biggest financial impact, whatever criteria you use, make sure that that's getting all the way into the prioritization of the risks as well. Dejan, feel free to chime in on anything you've come across related to this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, these are excellent points, and this is what we also see as very often the problems that actually companies are making and mistakes that they weren't really aware about. I would add another one that we very commonly see is that when it comes to smaller companies, very often they use risk assessment methodology, which would be much more appropriate for a large company, and which is far too complex for them actually to implement. Where they define that they have to, assess several aspects of risks. Other than impact and likelihood, which are mandatory, and then actually it becomes too complicated, too slow, too cumbersome, really, for them to handle this. So I know this is not strictly, I would say, the requirement of the standard, really, to kind of watch over these things, but still, I see this as a big problem for smaller companies, that they simply, get into something or try to apply something that is not really, I would say, relevant or appropriate for them. So. Again, for smaller companies, I would say, always optimize this risk assessment to, let's say, what the standard requires, and handle this in, I would say, some meaningful and rather, I would say, easy way to go through it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Dejan, and I see that a lot. There's different tools out there. There's even toolkits, document kits, things like that, and in my experience, and those are all great tools to use, but the most successful companies are the ones that take the time to tailor those things to what they do in their circumstances. And yeah, I've absolutely seen, like you mentioned, they found this great risk assessment tool, and it's super complex, and it doesn't really make sense with the business they're in or the resources they have, and it ends up, being more of a burden than something that's helping them to identify and treat risk. So, yeah. 100% agree on that. Okay. Keep moving here to kind of the other side of this coin, which is the risk treatment process. Again, risk treatment is you've gone through the risk assessment process, you've identified your risk, you've identified your unacceptable risks, you've prioritized your risks. Now you need to actually go through the process of, okay, how are we going to treat this risk down to an acceptable level? The first point here is excluding controls that are applicable. So the standard, there's a Annex A in the standard, if you know, it's a control set, and you're directed to go through each control in that annex and determine if it would apply to your organization, meaning if there would be some risks that could be treated by the inclusion of that control. I will say for this point, this is typically only an issue I come across at stage 1 audits. It's usually companies first time implementing. There can be confusion, especially with high reliance on cloud service providers. I've seen companies, not really understand, I would say, the shared responsibility model, which is something that you can find for your Amazons, your Microsofts. All the big players have these models, and basically it just clearly points out, here's what we're responsible for as the cloud service provider, and here's what you're responsible for as the person using our service or platform or infrastructure, etc. Just anecdotally, I went to a stage 1 once, and they had excluded, all the access controls, and with the justification of they use Microsoft, and we had a discussion, and turns out, yes, they still were responsible for provisioning accounts and assigning permissions. So we went through that process of them understanding, how that still would be applicable to their organization. Another one I see, it could be around physical security. Obviously, you're not responsible for the physical security, at a data center that Amazon or Microsoft might own. But there would still be a risk if your cloud service provider put all their servers in a parking lot somewhere, right? Like if people could just walk up to these things. So it still matters. Even though you may not be the one responsible for it, there's still an expectation that you're vetting that out, right? And you're understanding what they have in place and that you're comfortable with that and it meets your requirements. So even if you're not the one who's actually implementing it, it can still be applicable to you. Oops, sorry, didn't need to do that. Okay, next point here, creating a statement of applicability that includes all the requirements of the standard. So the standard does require justification not only for excluded controls, but also for included controls, which I see often overlooked. And this could be a simple justification. It could be as simple as results of risk assessment, right? Like we did our risk assessment, we saw that this control does in fact, could treat risk that is present at our organization. So results of risk assessment. Another justification for inclusion could be a customer requirement, could be a regulatory requirement, could be a lot of different things. But typically I see excluded controls will usually have justifications documented, but not in every case do the included controls have that. So I wanted to point that out. The other part of this is the standard requires that you have to document if the selected controls have been implemented or not. So there should be a implementation status or something of that nature, which again is another one that I see fairly frequently. Excuse me. The next point, so creating risk treatment plans. So again, you've done your risk assessment. You've done a great job with that. You've identified your risks. You've prioritized them. You've said, this risk right here, we need to treat this. I don't see this all the time, but I have seen where there was just no treatment plan on more than one occasion. So you want to make sure that you're getting all the way through this process to actually driving improvement to your information security, right? So you want to make sure that those treatment plans are put together, that those treatment plans have responsible parties, and that you can report on the status of the implementation of those treatment plans. And the last point in terms of the risk treatment process is obtaining approval of the treatment plan and the residual information security risks, right? So again, this is a requirement of the standard. And why this is important is you want to make sure, that the folks responsible for these treatment plans endorse them and are on board with them. But the other big part of this is the residual information security risks. I really like to see that top leadership, ownership management, those folks have gotten the chance to look at the risk treatment plan, see the residual level of risk that's going to exist after the fact, and they've signed off and said, yes, I'm good with this. That really helps get the ISMS out of the IT department maybe, or compliance department, and get it into the organization as a whole, when top management can see what this really translates to, right? What these risks could mean for the company, and make sure that they're buying in as well. Dejan, thoughts?
Yeah, I fully agree with all of these things, and again, this is right on point, and very often we have to help clients, realize all of these things and help them implement this. I would add another thing related to statement of applicability, or maybe two things around the statement of applicability. I would say most of the clients that get across 27001 for the first time, they don't really get it, what this document is about. I mean, statement of applicability. They don't understand this importance. And they don't see why is it important for auditors, and why is it important for them as well. And therefore they simply try to kind of skip it through and don't really do it properly, whereas this is probably the most important, maybe not the most important, but certainly one of the most important documents in 27001. And this kind of understanding of this central point of SOA is one thing. Second thing around this SOA is that very often we see companies that are compliant with some other standards, like SOC 2 or things like this. They tend to add many more controls into SOA, and then they get basically duplications. Very often these other frameworks have very similar controls, but they are not kind of mapping them to 27001 controls, and they end up with SOA with not 93 controls, but with, I don't know, 193 or 993 controls, which is obviously too much. So I would say, in the interest of kind of optimizing this whole process, it's much better to map these controls into 27001, just to handle them in an easier way. And just to mention here, so the other day I published this article around, I compared ISO 27001 with NIS2. This is the new cybersecurity regulation in Europe. Anyway, it came out that out of something like 40 or so cybersecurity requirements, 39 of them are actually fully mappable to 27001. Only one is not, which means that if a company needs to go for both 27 and NIS2, then you can very easily map all these controls into NIS2, and you actually have to create only one separate for NIS2. So the point being is, you can actually optimize this writing of this document and the whole implementation process later on by simply, mapping these controls into whatever other framework you're using.
Yeah, great point. It gives folks a single place to kind of keep track of all that stuff, to demonstrate to interested parties how they're meeting those requirements. And yeah, like you mentioned, I know there's mappings for 27001 to a lot of different frameworks, and I think in every case that I've seen, it's always 95% or so coverage with the control set that exists in 27001. So you can reduce a lot of duplicated work and keep things straight in one spot. And also, to your point about the statement of applicability, I know as an auditor, we basically use that kind of as our roadmap when we start going through your controls, right? Your statement of applicability is going to show us what's applicable. It's going to have typically a reference to a policy or a document of indicating its implementation. So it's a key document for your auditors as well to help drive the audit. All right. So I'm going to get into some more kind of specific issues I see around certain controls. First one here we're going to talk about is access control. I apologize. This came from the previous version of the standard where these three controls were separate. They've kind of been lumped together in the latest revision, but points are still certainly valid. The first one is around provisioning and modifying access rights. So, the control does require that rights are provisioned, reviewed, modified, and removed in accordance with the topic-specific policy on access control. There's many ways to manage this. Previously, a formal process was required. Where you'd actually have some kind of formalized process, whether it be a ticket submitted, needs to be approved by these folks, whatever the case may be. I've seen companies who use emails. Again, it's 27001 isn't prescriptive about the tools you have to use, so you're free to do whatever works for you. As an auditor, ideally, what I would expect to see is, if we pick the user account on one of your systems that you administer, and we saw what access they had, there would be some record or some trail of when it was requested, who approved it, maybe even why it was requested. But we'd be able to track down and kind of understand why any given level of access was given to a user account. Now, I will say I understand that for companies who are newly implementing the standard, who maybe have had a lot of user accounts that were created, prior to the implementation of the system, I can't expect to go back in time and make those things exist, but certainly from the time of implementation, there should be an audit trail that we could follow that would help us understand why a given user account has access to what they have. Another big one I see is the review of access rights. So this is one I like to focus on because I feel in my time as an auditor, the findings around this and the related, extent analysis and corrective action response has been something very beneficial for clients. But basically access rights need to be reviewed, not as part of the offboarding process, because I have had clients tell me that, well, when they do the offboard, that's when they disable account, and that somehow counts as the review of user access as well. But it should be something that happens on a regular basis or schedule. Again, it's up to you to determine what that frequency is. That should really be informed by, how frequently you have turnover, the number of users you have, things of that nature. But ideally, all access is being reviewed and approved on a scheduled basis. And the main issue I see from these reviews not being done kind of leads right into point 3, which is removing access. But yeah, I've had more than one occasion, I picked a random user account out of a list, and that individual no longer worked for the company. Oh, they've been gone for 3 months. Oh, okay. And I've even had a client who, as part of their extent analysis, obviously did a full review, and they found like over 40 user accounts that were still active for people who no longer work for the company. So obviously there's a host of risks associated with that. So I do think it's critical to have an effective review process in place. And you want to make sure that folks certainly are cut off from access as soon as it's no longer needed. And Dejan, I'll let you speak to your opinions on this as well, the things you may have seen.
Yeah. These are great examples. Unfortunately, they're all true. All these companies have these kind of problems, especially with removing the accounts that are not active anymore. But typically we see, I would say, 2 types of companies. One type of companies, especially smaller ones, are the ones that have no idea what this access control is all about. Why would we have it? Here we have this system administrator, and he gives the access. Why would you complicate it more than this? They don't understand this risk, I would say, aspect of it. They don't understand this business point of allowing the access to some systems or data. So, to these types of companies, we have to explain, why this is needed in the first place. And then there are, other types of companies who already have, the access control in place, and they're using systems like you mentioned, like, they're approving access, through email or I don't know, through some kind of applications, maybe ticketing systems or Slack, these kind of things. And these companies are then, frustrated because they don't understand how this approval needs to be done. And then we have to explain them, look, but you're already doing this. You just have to document. I mean, you have to write a procedure or a policy that you're actually doing it in exactly the same way that, you're doing it already. So they think that there is some kind of a special ISO way of approving access, whereas it's, as simple as, sending an email that approval is given. So it's, we usually face these kind of, these 2 types of companies.
Yeah, that's a good point too, about the companies who actually are doing it and then kind of get a little anxiety about, well, what do I have to do now? And it's, well, you just keep doing what you're doing, but write it in your procedure and policy that this is in fact what you do. Yeah. All right. Going here on to physical controls. These are again and NCRs that I've written pretty frequently. They crop up. The first one is around clear desk and clear screen policy. And I will say that this probably got written up a lot more when we were doing all these audits in person, because we would be there and could look around. But obviously, you don't want to get up from your workstation or laptop or whatever you're using and leave it unlocked and unattended. So this is obviously going to be largely driven by training and kind of reinforcement. I realize this does require buy-in, right, from everybody in the organization. So I know that can be tricky sometimes as well, but certainly one that I've seen crop up more than once. The other part of the clear desk and clear screen policy, excuse me, is clean printed materials or printed sensitive materials, you know, left around, maybe unattended on printers, or you know, left out on desks. And obviously, this wouldn't be just any printed material, but sensitive information. Again, this was something that we'd see a lot as we did our tours of offices. You know, we'd check printers, look underneath, scanning glass, things like that, pull up the copier top, see if there's anything there. And again, just requires training and reinforcement and buy-in by all employees, but certainly important as well. The other control that I wanted to touch on, it's not necessarily a common issue I see, but because this is a new control in the 2022 revision of the standard, I did want to speak to it because I do have many clients with international offices, and I've learned over the years that you don't just get to record people like we do in America everywhere else. There's a lot of privacy and regulation around it, so it's not always possible to have cameras. So I just wanted to say this control does not strictly require video or CCTV monitoring. You know, there's other options. There's alarm systems. You can have guards. You can have you know, staffed front desks, entrances that are watched by staff. Lots of different ways. But I did want to touch on that just because that's something that I've learned over the years. And I was just ignorant to it, but I thought you could record anybody anywhere. If you own a company, you have a building, you can put cameras up, and that's not necessarily the case. So I did want to touch on that. Dejan, I don't know if you have any insight.
Yeah, these are great points, especially with this new control. I mean, with any new control in the standard, like this physical security monitoring or the other controls, there's always, you know, big, let's say, unknown, you know, on how to implement them and so on. Whereas most of them can be actually done through, I would say, some rather simple ways to basically, you know, comply with them. Now, in general, when it comes to physical controls, what we see is, since we work a lot with these fully remote companies or virtual companies, so they don't have offices, they all work from home, and then they tend to exclude all controls, or I mean, mark all the controls, physical controls, as not applicable in the statement of applicability. And then, you know, we try to explain them this is a mistake. First of all, they usually do have some papers, which are, you know, after all, a physical thing that they have to protect. I mean, papers like, you know, if nothing else, receipts, you know, from purchases around. They might have signed some physical contracts with clients. They might have some official correspondence with some government bodies, these kind of things. So typically companies still do have paper, and therefore they have to apply these controls related to paper. I mean, paper as the media of that has information. And the second thing is with the virtual companies, these virtual companies still do have you know, like smartphones, laptops, you know, all kinds of devices. And these are in the physical world, right? So they have to protect them anyway using some of these physical controls. So the point here is, you know, even though if you're a virtual company, you cannot simply say, okay, I'm scratching all these out, you know, it doesn't apply to me. No, it does. Maybe not all the controls from this section, but at least some of them typically yes.
Yeah, you're still a person in the physical world, and at least for now, the equipment we use is still in the physical world, so it certainly needs to be protected. All right. This next one is an interesting one. So I do find this particular control to be fairly prescriptive when compared to the others. And I think it's actually it can be a lot more than it appears on the surface, but legal, statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements. So the control explicitly states that those items must be documented and maintained. So these need to be identified and documented. And additionally, it also says that your approach for meeting each requirement is documented and maintained. So again, depending on your organization, the sector you operate in, the part of the world you operate in, this can be a huge task. There's obviously a lot of different privacy laws out there. There's different cybersecurity related laws. There's all sorts of things. So if you are an international company, right, obviously this could be a lot more of a task. But even if not, there's still probably going to be some requirements, regulatory, contractual, or otherwise, that you have to comply with, and you need to keep those documented and maintained in some type of register. In terms of documenting and maintaining your approach to meeting them, it's going to depend on what the requirement is. I have companies who have to comply with GDPR, and they simply refer to their privacy policy or certain procedures that they have in place in terms of meeting that requirement to document your approach to meeting the regulatory requirement. But again, this can be a large task. It's usually going to be outside of IT's purview strictly. You're going to need some type of compliance or someone who fills that role. You might need outside help, but again, I think it's certainly worthwhile in terms of understanding, right, what you're required to comply with, what it takes to comply with those things, and then what the risk is if you're not. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen have a similar outlook on this or not, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually, this control is probably the one that we actually get most of the questions about. We misunderstood the control probably in the whole standard. So the first dilemma clients are actually having are, is it how do you fill this up? What are these, or where do we find these legal, statutory, regulatory, contractual requirements? And then we have to explain them. Look, this basically comes from two sources. The first source is basically the laws and regulations of your own country. You have to list them. So if you are operating in the European Union, then yes, you have to comply with GDPR, because you're probably then also processing personal data. And on top of this, there are more and more of these cybersecurity regulations in almost any country. So it's not only GDPR. So one side of actually these sources are these laws and regulations. The other side are actually contractual requirements. And then clients say, okay, but where do I find them? And I tell them, look, but you have contracts, right? I mean, agreements signed with all these clients. You simply have to go through them. This is it. There's not much, it's not some rocket science there. You simply have to, browse through all these contracts, agreements, and see if you have any security clauses. If yes, then these are the inputs into your register of requirements. As simple as that. So this is what we have to educate, people, and then they get it. And the second challenge that companies typically face is, okay, we're operating in Germany, but do we have to list, laws and regulations from UK or from US? And then, they don't actually understand that this depends on where do they sell their products and services. If they're active in some other countries as well, then they have to basically seek legal opinion if this really complies with them. Usually it does. So if you're a US company and you serve products or services to any EU country, then you have to comply with GDPR if you collect personal data, and that's it. So it's not only laws and regulations for your own country if you're again selling services and products worldwide. So it's something that companies typically don't get right away. So it takes a little bit to again educate them on what really requirements are.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it can be a daunting task for certain, but I think there's obviously important as well. So,
and it's getting more and more complex. I mean, there are more and more of these laws and regulations, and it is. I mean, I understand it's getting. I mean, there are what 13 or so states in the United States which publish their own privacy laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And complicated further is everything being remote and virtual, and kind of the abstraction of physical location compared to what you do operationally, it can muddy the waters even more. But I think the point that you made about who and where you sell goods and services it's a good place to start in terms of understanding what you need to comply with.
Yep.
All right. Well, that gets us through what we had prepared in the slide deck. But Dejan, I know that you had some other material or items that are frequently seen by you that you wanted to touch on, and I thought I'd give you this opportunity to go through those if you'd like.
Sure, I can present some of them. If I wanted to present all of them, then this would take 2 hours.
Okay.
So probably not all, but only, let's say, some on top of my mind. So you know, I see very often that companies are, I mean, the mistake that they're doing is that they focus on writing documents, and they want, I mean, companies want their documents to look perfect, and they think actually this is it. Whereas this is not nearly it, right? It's not about having a nice document. It's actually about being more secure. So having nice documents is, let's say, on a path to actually becoming more secure. But what is much more important is that actually the employees of the company start complying with these documents, that they are trained, that they are aware of why this is important, that, you know, the management kind of endorses all of this security and so on. So there are so many other elements besides documents that are important, that actually you change the way you operate in your company so that your operations become more secure. So instead of, you know, focusing on documents, I think companies should really focus on actually security activities and let's say use these documents more as a tool to actually reach this higher level of security. And again, this is something that very often needs explaining and educating so that you know, companies understand this. And also related to documentation is that again, smaller companies with which we often work with, they, you know, tend to create this excessive documentation, meaning, you know, writing documents that maybe are not needed, because I mean there are something like 15 or so mandatory documents, and you don't have to create I don't know 500 or 100 documents if you're a small company, right? So the point being here is that these smaller companies often write too many documents, thinking that actually this will help them with certification or with security, whereas usually the opposite is true. If you have too many documents, first of all, it's going to be much harder for you to implement this. This becomes an overhead, and this doesn't help security. Actually, the opposite is true. This actually prevents better security, because people in the company are puzzled and they don't really know, you know, what they have to do. They don't have time to read all of these documents and so on. So, in my view, you know, complexity is the biggest enemy of security. And if you can optimize not only your security processes, but also your security documents, then you have a much higher chance of gaining a good security in your company and ultimately complying and passing the certification on it. So
yeah.
These are my impressions, so general impressions when it comes to documentation and these kind of things.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Again, like I said, there's a lot of different tools out there, and they can all work great, but in my experience, I've never seen anything that just kind of drops in and takes care of itself, right? These all need to be looked at and attended to and kind of tailored and bent to the needs of the organization and what they do and what makes sense for them. That's when you'll get the most benefit out of it. All right, well, we've had some questions come in, Dejan. So I was gonna try and go through these. It looks like
Sure.
Santosh had a few comments here. There was a couple questions around, you know, despite so many companies being certified to 27001 for decades, why are there cybersecurity incidents occurring so often worldwide? And I mean, so my comment on that is, you know, I still think there's a large number of companies, not only that aren't ISO 27001 certified, but still kind of have their head in the sand a little bit about this, and they just, you know, aren't realizing the real world risk and impact that we as a society, when we decided to do everything online because it's easier, I don't know if there was much thought given to if we should or if it was safe, but it worked and it was fast, and now we're trying to catch up to that, right? So in terms of why there's so many cybersecurity incidents, the way I look at it is if you were allowed to try and rob a bank infinite times and no one would even know that you were trying to do it, and there was no repercussions for trying to do it, and you could even program something to do it on your behalf against many banks automatically. The point is that there's not a lot of deterrence in place for trying to find exploits, right? And then using those to whatever end you may want to get to. So I think it's more a symptom of, you know, there's a lot of things that are exposed to the public internet, and it makes things able to be, you know, pounded on and exploited. So, Dejan, I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, as you were saying, this attack surface, as they call it in these cybersecurity circles, is much greater now than it was, I don't know, 10 years ago or 20 or 30. You know, my kids are laughing at me when I try to explain that, you know, when I was young, there were no cell phones, right? No smartphones. So now, I mean, everyone has them. So, you know, this really opportunity to hack someone or something, you know, are much greater now than they were, you know, even a year ago, especially with the, you know, advent of AI and all these things. So the technology is really progressing greatly, and therefore, you know, the things that can get hacked are simply, you know, much more than they were before. And another thing about ISO 27001, you know, it's this standard or the certificate is not a guarantee that a company is not going to get hacked or that they are not going to get any incidents. However, if you are certified or if you are fully compliant, this, I would say, drastically decreases the chances of getting of having an incident. So if you had, I don't know, I would say this is probably around 80 or 90% decrease in chances that you will get an incident or that you will get hacked. So again, 27 is not a guarantee, but it is certainly, I would say, a huge help in decreasing these risks.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that statement. And excuse me, the other part is you're also going to have some incident response procedures in place, and hopefully, you know, you've gone through these and you know, are prepared to use them if needed. But yeah, you'll certainly be able to respond more effectively if something like that does happen. But to your point, yeah, absolutely, being certified does not protect you or you know, insulate you from having incidents take place. But it certainly does, I'd say, compared to a company who doesn't have these things in place, it certainly reduces your risk. Let's see here, okay. So we had a question from Brad. Looks like it was about, he was saying if you have controls that are based on external requirements, he gave an example of, you know, a defense contractor might have requirements related to NIST 800-171. Is there a method to ensure that controls that aren't in Annex A that are applicable are also not excluded? So Brad, I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I will say the standard definitely directs you to, if you have additional controls that you need, your organization needs outside of what's included in Annex A, you know, the standard definitely directs you to include those controls on your statement of applicability, so that you can track them there and you still have a kind of a single ledger, right, with all the controls that you need to comply with, regardless of if they come from Annex A or a contractual requirement, as you said in this case. And Dejan, feel free to comment on that.
Oh, I mean, you know, if there is already some kind of mapping between, let's say, in this case, NIST standards and Annex A, then it's easier to kind of be able to not to overlook or exclude some of these controls. But you know, if they're not, then you simply have to read through all the controls. You know, sometimes people are forgetting about the basics. You know, it's not all about mapping. Sometimes you have to read through all the 93 controls and find out what's applicable and what's not. Sometimes then there is no way around it. You simply have to do it.
Yeah, no magic bullet, right? Okay. D had a question about how do you audit the clear desk and clear screen policy in remote environments? So D, the best we can, I'll say, but typically for organizations that are completely remote, we'll look at what their policy says and what the requirements are around physical security. But we'll use, typically we'll use cell phones, right? We'll have someone join a Teams call from their cell phone, give a tour of a facility or of a space. We'll ask them, can you show me this? Can you go over there? Can you pull on that door? Is that locked? Things of that nature. So we basically, are given a video tour and kind of direct our client to look at different areas to make sure that there's nothing out of place. So yeah. Good question here from Cynthia. Are the legal, statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements only those related to security? So in terms of what I'm looking for during your ISO 27001 audit, yeah, I'm looking for security related requirements, not necessarily looking or have the ability to determine if you comply with non-security related requirements. That would certainly be a much longer and different audit. But Dejan, is that typically how you direct your clients, or do you have a different view on that?
This is exactly what we do, and GDPR is actually a great example of this. So I'm not sure if you read the GDPR. It's quite long and quite boring, but the point is, that from GDPR, only this Article 32 actually applies to security. So when it comes to actually requirements, these security requirements in context of 27001, it's actually only Article 32 from GDPR. All these other, let's say, articles of GDPR are more or less around legal compliance, so not directly security. So it's really about security and so whatever has a security component.
There you go. Hope that answers your question, Cynthia. Antoinette had a question: if an organization is ISO 9001 certified, does it make it easier to implement ISO 27001? I think it certainly does from a few different perspectives, Antoinette. So number one, if a company is certified to 9001, they're familiar with ISO. They're familiar with the ISO auditing process, surveillance process. They're familiar with things that are common to both standards, like internal audits, management reviews, certain aspects of risk, obviously not so much information security, but there's a lot of common elements to both standards. I think ISO actually intentionally tried to align their requirements across the standards as much as they could to make integrating them easier. So I certainly think it would be less of a lift for a company who's already 9001 certified for the reasons I mentioned, but there's certainly still going to be a good deal of work, right? Because you have to go through all those controls in Annex A and implement what you need to implement, the whole risk assessment and treatment process. It's still a bear on itself, but I think you would have a leg up over a company who's never done anything with ISO before, starting from scratch. And Dejan, I don't know if you feel the same or different.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely it helps. Some companies are building this what is called integrated management system. Using I would say the same policies or procedures for more standards. Like typically it would be document control. This could be, I don't know, internal audit, maybe even management review up to the point. So you can actually use some of these things for several standards. But I would say even more important than that is that I would say frame of the mind. If you already implemented one standard, then you understand what management system is. And then it's much easier actually to implement another management system, even though it's I would say on a different topic. But you still, you at least understand, what are kind of what is the logic, and this is what typically helps the most.
Yeah, agreed. Great point. All right. Another question here from Jeff. It says there seems to be some confusion to what is expected to be ready for a stage 1 audit. Can you provide your thoughts on this, please? Certainly, Jeff. So, stage 1 audit, we are looking to confirm your readiness to proceed to the stage 2, and we're also looking to understand your organization, your information security management system, Right. What we would expect to look at is obviously we're gonna want to look at your scope. We're gonna understand and agree the scope of the system. We're gonna look and make sure that you've done a risk assessment, that you've created a statement of applicability. We're gonna look to understand how you've implemented the controls you've selected. So firstly, we'll talk about any excluded controls and if there's any issues there. And then secondly, we'll just look at the controls in general and kind of run through and say, okay, what's your approach to doing this? And realistically, the biggest benefit for us as an auditor is we're preparing for the stage 2 audit. So we're actually trying to, start understanding the types of things that we need to look for and ask about during the stage 2 audit. We also want to look to see that an internal audit has been completed or will be completed prior to the stage 2 audit, and that a management review has taken place after the internal audit was completed and prior to the stage 2 audit. So that's the main points of what we're trying to capture at the stage 1 to determine if you're ready to proceed to the stage 2 or not. And I hope that answers your question. And Dejan, I don't know if you have other things that you typically like to have clients ready for the stage 1 or a different set of criteria.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with the things you said, yeah, as you said, we emphasize to clients that they have to perform these couple of last steps in the implementation, the internal audit management review, close corrective actions, before they actually go for stage 1. So it's important part of the preparation process.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions rolling in, guys. So I just, again, Dejan, I'd like to thank you so much for joining today and providing your insight and experience. I'd like to thank everybody who came and joined us and watched, and I hope that you got some good information and it was beneficial. And certainly feel free to reach out to either of us, if you have any more questions about ISO 27001.
Yeah, thanks, John, for inviting me again, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
All right, take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.